It was one of those golden summer Saturdays when the air hums with the promise of peace. The sun had just begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across my quiet suburban neighborhood. Everything about the day was perfect. Kids laughing in the distance, sprinklers ticking away on freshly trimmed lawns, and the gentle buzz of cicadas weaving through the breeze. I had just finished stacking the last of the pool chairs, ready to begin the seasonal ritual of closing up the backyard pool. As much as I loved it, the pool had seen enough cannonballs and floaties for the year, and with vacation plans coming up, it made sense to wrap it up early. My house sits at the end of a cul-de-sac, tucked behind a curtain of tall hedges and a wooden fence that offers just enough privacy from the world beyond. The pool, my little oasis, had always been a source of joy, but it was mine. Emphasis on mine. Not shared, not rented out, and definitely not a public amenity for anyone to use at will. Yet lately, I had started to feel the creeping gaze of a certain neighbor who seemed a little too interested in my property. I had no idea at the time, but what should have been a simple, uneventful day would spiral into a bizarre confrontation that felt more like a sitcom than real life. Because when you live next to someone who thinks they run the neighborhood, even something as straightforward as closing your own pool can become a declaration of war. Little did I know, my peaceful afternoon was about to be hijacked by a woman who had crowned herself queen of a homeowners association that didn't even exist. Karen moved into the neighborhood about 2 years ago, and from the moment she unpacked her U-Haul, it was clear she saw herself as something more than just a neighbor. Within days, she was knocking on doors, clipboard in hand, introducing herself as the neighborhood liaison, a title no one had ever heard of, and certainly no one had voted on. She claimed it was her mission to preserve the harmony of our community, but what she really meant was, she wanted control. Her short blonde bob and oversized sunglasses became a kind of suburban battle armor. You could spot her marching down the sidewalk, inspecting trash can placements, lawn heights, and porch decor, like a self-deputized officer of a homeowners association that, to this day, still doesn't exist. She was the kind of person who'd leave anonymous notes in your mailbox if your holiday lights weren't down by January 2nd. She once scolded my next-door neighbor for having what she called non-compliant garden gnomes. The worst part was that Karen spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she had real authority. It was like dealing with a mall cop who thought she was the sheriff of a Wild West town. Except her badge was a laminated name tag that just said Karen, with a glittery smiley face. Most people tried to ignore her. Others were too polite to confront her directly, brushing off her unsolicited feedback with tight-lipped smiles. But I'd always been the type to mind my own business, and for a while, I thought if I just kept to myself, she'd leave me alone. I was wrong. Something about my backyard pool must have triggered a new level of interest. Maybe it was envy. Maybe it was just the fact that she couldn't control it. Whatever it was, I became her new obsession. She'd started making comments, subtle at first. How nice it must be to have a pool when others had to suffer through heat waves. Then she started asking if I'd consider opening it to the community. It was absurd, of course. This wasn't a neighborhood pool. This was my pool, bought and paid for, maintained by me alone. But for Karen, it wasn't about logic. It was about control. And what she couldn't control, she had a habit of trying to claim anyway. It was a Thursday afternoon when Karen showed up at my door, all smiles and dripping with artificial charm. She held a stack of glossy flyers in one hand and a clipboard in the other, like she was about to pitch a timeshare. Before I could even say hello, she launched into her speech, announcing with practiced cheer that she was so excited for the upcoming community pool bash that I was so gracious to host. I blinked, confused, trying to process what she was saying. Her words hit me like a wave. Community pool bash? Gracious host? What was she talking about? She handed me a flyer and pointed to the date and time. This Saturday, 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., right there in bold blue letters. Bring your swimsuits, snacks, and positive vibes, it read. At the bottom, it proudly declared, hosted at 113 Sycamore Lane. Private pool access courtesy of Mr. My last name. I stared at it, speechless, as if I'd just discovered a forged invitation to a wedding I didn't know I was having. I looked up, stunned, and said, Karen, I never agreed to this. Her smile faltered for just a split second before bouncing back into place. Oh, you must have forgotten, she chirped. I mentioned it last week when I saw you pulling weeds by your driveway. You nodded. I took that as a yes. I remembered the moment clearly. She had shouted something vague across the yard while I was halfway buried in a flower bed with headphones in. I hadn't heard a word. I told her directly, this party wasn't happening, and no one would be using my pool. But Karen didn't flinch. She said it was already planned. People had RSVP'd, and it would be rude to cancel now. She went on about how she'd even ordered decorations and cupcakes from a local bakery. According to her, this was a chance to unite the neighborhood and build community morale. When I repeated that, I had never consented to this and that my pool was off limits, she gave me a tight smile, muttered something about selfishness, and walked off in a huff, already dialing someone on her phone. That was when I realized she wasn't going to take no for an answer. The next day, I found a printed notice taped to my mailbox. It looked suspiciously official at first glance, formatted like a classic HOA memo, except there was no HOA in our neighborhood. At the top, in bold capital letters, it read, Notice of Scheduled Community Event. It went on to say that residents were encouraged to participate in a generously hosted pool gathering, again citing my address as the location. My jaw clenched as I read through the absurd document. There were even made-up rules listed, like no glass containers and pool floats must be family-friendly, as if she thought this fantasy pool party came with some kind of municipal ordinance. I ripped the paper off and stormed over to her house. Karen was watering her front lawn like she had nothing to worry about, her hose leisurely tracing the edges of her flower beds. I held the notice up, my tone measured but firm. Take this down, Karen. Cancel the party. I already told you, my pool isn't available. She didn't even turn off the hose. Well, I can't just cancel it now, she replied with a scoff. People are excited. You said you weren't using the pool this weekend, so what's the harm? I reminded her again that this was private property and I never gave permission. I told her clearly, no one is allowed in my yard, and anyone who shows up will be asked to leave. That's when the mask started to slip. Her lips tightened, and her eyes narrowed just enough to let the charm fall away. You really don't understand how a community works, do you? She said, as if I'd committed a moral offense. Sometimes, you have to think about more than yourself. I stood my ground. Karen, this is my home, my pool, my rules. End of story. She gave me a cold smile. Fine, she said. But don't be surprised when the rest of the neighborhood sees what kind of person you really are. With that, she turned her back and walked into her house, letting the hose spill over onto her driveway. I knew in that moment that she wasn't going to let it go. The party was still on, at least in her mind. Saturday arrived like a storm brewing under blue skies. I woke up early, determined to put an end to this nonsense before it even started. The pool cover was already half secured from the day before, and I spent the morning finishing the job, locking down the safety latches, stacking the lounge chairs in the shed, and even putting up a small, private property, no trespassing sign on the gate, just to be clear. I had done everything short of building a moat to signal that this backyard was off limits. By noon, the air was heavy with heat and tension. I tried to relax inside, hoping that maybe, just maybe, Karen had finally come to her senses. At exactly 1:45 p.m., I heard the unmistakable screech of her minivan's brakes just outside. I peeked through the blinds, and there she was, stepping out like she was arriving at a wedding venue she personally designed. She wore an oversized sun hat, a bright floral cover-up, and carried a basket filled with party supplies. Behind her, a parade of neighbors trailed in, some with folding chairs, others with coolers, and a few bewildered kids in swimsuits holding pool noodles. My heart sank. Karen marched right up to the side gate, which I had locked earlier, and rattled it impatiently. She turned toward the crowd and called out cheerfully, "Just a little snag, everyone. He must have forgotten we needed access." Then she rang the doorbell. When I opened the door, her smile vanished. "Can you unlock the gate now?" she asked, as if this was just a small misunderstanding. I looked past her to the small gathering on my front lawn, people already looking uneasy. I shook my head. "Karen, no one is coming into my yard. I told you this wasn't happening." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're really going to do this? Embarrass me in front of everyone? Do you know how hard I worked to organize this?" I stayed calm. "You organized it without my permission. That's not my problem." She looked me up and down, then turned back to her guests. "He's being difficult," she snapped, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Give me a minute. I'll handle this." That's when I knew she was far from done. Karen didn't wait for my response. She spun on her heel and marched right back to the gate, her heels crunching against the gravel with purpose. Then, in front of everyone, she pulled a small keychain from her bag and started trying different keys on the lock. My jaw dropped. She actually brought keys, assuming I'd used the same lock as last summer, a cheap one I'd long since replaced. When none of them worked, she pounded on the gate and called out, "Does anyone have bolt cutters? I think he's accidentally locked us out." I stepped outside, my patience hanging by a thread. "Karen, you are not coming into my yard. You are not hosting a party here. This is my home, my pool, and none of you were ever invited." She turned to face me, arms crossed and chin high like she was rallying troops. "It's not just your neighborhood. We all live here. You don't get to keep everything to yourself." A few of her guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another. One father pulled his son back a few steps from the gate, whispering something about maybe heading home. But Karen wasn't giving up that easily. She stormed back toward me, her voice rising. "You're being completely unreasonable," she snapped. "You gave me your word." "I never gave you anything," I said, keeping my voice firm. "This isn't just rude. It's trespassing. You're on private property right now, and I need you and your guests to leave immediately." Karen's eyes went wide, her lips parting like she couldn't believe I'd used the word trespassing. For a second, I thought she'd back off. But then something flickered behind her eyes. Defiance, desperation, maybe both. She turned to her phone, holding it up dramatically. "If you're going to threaten me," she said, "I'm calling the police." I raised an eyebrow. "Good. Maybe they can explain property laws to you." She stared at me for a long second, then tapped 911 on her screen, making a big show of it like she was starring in a reality TV meltdown. I watched as she began to spin her tale to the dispatcher, her voice loud and panicked. That was when I realized she truly believed she was in the right, and that made her even more dangerous. Karen paced in tight circles on my front lawn, phone pressed dramatically to her ear, her voice rising with each word. "Yes, I'm at 113 Sycamore Lane," she said, throwing a hand in the air for effect. "We were supposed to have a scheduled neighborhood pool gathering, and now the homeowner is locking us out and getting aggressive." She shot me a glare, like she was daring me to interrupt. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching this bizarre theater unfold. I pulled out my phone and started recording. not out of pettiness, but because I knew how this could go. Karen was the type who could cry on command and twist facts until you started to question your own reality. The last thing I needed was to be on the receiving end of some bogus accusation without evidence. She continued speaking into the phone, using loaded words like hostile, uncooperative, and refusing access to the community. I caught one of her friends quietly whispering to their partner, clearly reconsidering their decision to show up. After hanging up, Karen spun around and declared, "They're sending someone over. Maybe now you'll learn what happens when you don't follow community agreements." "There is no community agreement," I said calmly. "There's no HOA. You made this all up." She didn't reply. Instead, she began rearranging her party supplies on the sidewalk like nothing had happened. Cupcakes, folding chairs, plastic beach balls, all laid out as if this was still going to turn into the party of the year. Some of her guests took a few hesitant steps back. Others awkwardly lingered, unsure whether to stay or pretend they'd just been out for a walk. 15 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. Karen's posture immediately shifted into full performance mode. She walked briskly toward the officer, flailing her arms and pointing at me like she was unveiling the villain in a soap opera. I stayed where I was, phone still recording, documents in hand proving property ownership. As she launched into her twisted version of events, I couldn't help but marvel at the confidence it took to lie so boldly. She really believed she could bend the truth to her will. But what she didn't realize was that reality, and the law, was about to catch up with her. The officer stepped out of the car with the kind of calm that comes from years of responding to neighborhood disputes. He wore mirrored sunglasses and a neutral expression as Karen rushed toward him, gesturing wildly like she was reporting a kidnapping instead of a cancelled pool party. I stayed back by the gate, holding my folder of documents and resisting the urge to shake my head in disbelief. She launched into her performance, voice trembling with manufactured outrage. He promised us access to his pool, then locked the gate and started threatening us when we arrived. There are children here. The officer gave her a slow nod, his face unreadable. "Ma'am, is this a community pool or private property?" he asked. Karen blinked, like she hadn't considered that question might matter. "Well," she stammered, "technically it's his, but he told me we could use it. And I've already invited people. It's all planned." Now it was my turn. I stepped forward, calm and collected, and handed over my ID, a copy of the property deed, and a printed version of the fake event flyer with my address splashed across the bottom. I explained the situation clearly. Karen had fabricated a pool party at my private residence, distributed flyers, and refused to cancel it even after I made it clear no one was invited. I also let the officer know I had video of her trying to unlock my gate and then calling 911 under false pretenses. The officer glanced at the paperwork, looked around at the makeshift sidewalk party, and then turned back to Karen. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "you don't have the right to host events on someone else's property without permission. This isn't a community pool. You're trespassing." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But the community," she began, but he cut her off. "There is no HOA on record here. This is private property. If the homeowner asks you to leave and you don't, it becomes a legal issue. Do you understand?" There was silence, thick and awkward. Some of her guests began gathering their things, quietly slinking away without making eye contact. Karen stood frozen, her carefully crafted illusion crumbling before her eyes. The truth had finally caught up with her, and it wasn't going anywhere. Karen's face turned a blotchy shade of red as the officer's words sank in. The confident, authoritative tone she'd clung to all day was replaced by something more fragile, panic mixed with wounded pride. She turned to the dispersing crowd, raising her voice in a last-ditch effort to salvage the situation. You all saw this. He promised me. He said yes. He's just being petty because I tried to bring people together." Her voice cracked near the end, no longer commanding, just desperate. But her guests weren't buying it anymore. One woman picked up a tray of untouched cupcakes and quietly said, "We really thought this was cleared with him, Karen." Another dad muttered something about wasting his afternoon before guiding his kids back toward the sidewalk. Each step away from her felt like a nail in the coffin of her imaginary authority, and she knew it. She turned back to me, eyes wide with disbelief, as if I had betrayed some unwritten contract she had invented in her head. "You're going to regret this," she spat. "This was supposed to be my event. This was supposed to show everyone I care about this community." I raised an eyebrow. "By lying to them and using my property without asking?" That set her off. She stomped toward the officer, jabbing a finger in the air. "He's lying. He said yes. He said. Her voice trailed off as tears welled in her eyes, not from genuine sadness, but from the raw sting of humiliation. The officer gave her a firm but calm look. "Ma'am, you need to leave the property now. We're done here." Karen didn't move right away. She stood there, trembling, looking around like she was hoping someone would jump to her defense. But no one did. One by one, her audience disappeared, leaving behind folding chairs and scattered party supplies. The illusion of control she had so carefully constructed collapsed around her. Finally, she gathered her things with shaking hands, muttering under her breath, "You'll see. People like you ruin neighborhoods." Then she marched down the sidewalk, still trying to hold her head high even as the remains of her ego dragged behind her like a deflated pool float. And just like that, the great pool party that never was came to a crashing end. By the time the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the last traces of Karen's failed parade vanished, the neighborhood had returned to its usual hum of quiet. I sat on the back porch with a cold drink, staring at the pool now fully covered and locked, reflecting on the sheer absurdity of the day. It still baffled me how far someone could go on nothing but entitlement and ego. All I had done was say no to something I never agreed to in the first place, and that was enough to send a grown woman spiraling into drama, fit for reality television. What struck me most wasn't just the chaos she created, but how fiercely she clung to her invented authority. Karen didn't care about the truth or boundaries. She cared about appearances, control, and the fleeting admiration of a crowd. Hosting a pool party wasn't about building community. It was about putting herself on display. And when that display cracked, so did she. But the real twist came a few days later. A neighbor texted me a screenshot from a newly created Facebook group titled "Sycamore Strong, Neighborhood Unity." The profile photo: Karen smiling awkwardly in front of a beach ball arch that had never been used. Her first post read, "Let's reclaim the spirit of togetherness. Our community deserves better than selfishness and closed gates." I nearly choked on my coffee. The comments, however, told a different story. Dozens of replies, mostly polite but direct, called out the stunt for what it was. Some apologized for showing up. Others gently suggested that maybe next time she should ask first. My favorite simply said, "Karen, please don't speak for the rest of us." I guess when you try to crown yourself queen of a kingdom that doesn't exist, eventually the subjects stop showing up.